Yeah, so this talk is going to be a little bit different from Eric's. Eric and I are both here in Illinois. We're just south of Chicago, and it's coming up on 3 a.m. for us. So very excited to be a part of this, and happy to try to use Warhammer 40K minis, um, maybe to do some interesting things for us in the philosophy of technology. So I'm Steve Case. I'm from Olivet Nazarene University. Let me just give you a quick sort of the plan for the talk. What I want to do is I want to introduce you to this concept from the philosophy of technology known as Borgman's paradigm. And it's going to involve this distinction between things and devices. Talk about why it's useful, why I think it's interesting, how it helps us sort of maybe navigate some of our interactions with technology today. But then what I want to make the case for is that Warhammer 40K minis do a really interesting job of sort of answering a question that this paradigm poses. And then even go beyond that to extend what I'm calling Borgman's thing device paradigm in some interesting ways. And then I'll sort of wrap it up by applying this sort of into a few test cases of what we might call technologies of play to see how Warhammer 40K minis stack up against some others. But before I get into all of that, just a little bit about myself. I am a historian primarily historian of science. I work in history of astronomy. I publish and write on history of astronomy and history of 19th century science. I also write and publish science fiction. I've had some stories appear in Asimov's science fiction magazine. But in this context, perhaps most importantly, I'm a father of four. And about 2 summers ago, 2 of my sons really got into Warhammer 40K. And so, of course, I followed them into this world and just really enjoyed learning about the lore, but specifically putting together the minifigures, painting them, and just was really enjoying this process. And sort of it finally hit me that this was a really interesting instantiation of something I had been talking about in some of my classes, which became the germ of this talk that I'm giving right now. So that's sort of my pathway into this. So I'm going to introduce you to Albert Borgman. Albert Borgman is a philosopher of technology. He's working primarily, he's at a university in Montana, and he publishes this work in 1984, which I believe is just before the first edition of Warhammer comes out. And he's writing about how we engage with technology in contemporary society. And he defines a device, and this becomes what's sometimes known as Borgman's device paradigm. He defines a device as a technological artifact that exists to provide a commodity and to make that commodity as easily accessible as possible, while simultaneously black boxing or distancing us from the mode of production of that commodity. And so in his book, he gives the example of a furnace, right? He says, a furnace exists to provide the commodity of heat. You want to turn it on and you want heat to come out. You're not really too interested necessarily in where the heat is coming from. You're not really interested in how the furnace works. In fact, you really don't want to engage with the furnace as a technological artifact. And unless you're having a really bad day, you're not getting into the guts of the furnace, or unless perhaps you're a furnace repairman. So he would sort of represents a furnace as an example of a device. It provides a commodity with the least amount of sort of your physical interaction with the thing as possible. Again, he's writing in the early 80s, so this idea has just become more ubiquitous. I mean, we call our artifacts devices, right? So we can think of our cell phone, for instance. It's a device. It exists to provide the commodity of communication, of connectivity, of information. But we don't really want to know. We don't want to get into the guts of our phone. We don't want to know where the rare earth elements for the battery come from. We don't really feel like we need to understand necessarily how the cell phone network works. And so again, Borgman's sort of device paradigm seemed almost really prescient, and really becomes sort of how we're interacting with technology more and more today. This is a really useful paradigm in some ways because it helps us sort of think about even really, really big technologies, right? So we could think of our energy infrastructure in some ways as a Borgmannian device. You plug your device, you plug your cell phone or your laptop into the wall. The energy is there. The commodity of energy is there. And again, we don't see how that energy is produced. We don't see necessarily how it gets to us. Devices help us sort of distance ourselves from, again, the mode of production. We can see this in our food production systems, right? And this can become really problematic because for Borgman, it's a problem because it effaces our interaction with the physical world. It distances us from our interaction with the physical world. And today, of course, we see a lot of the negative ramifications of that. So what's the answer to this? Well, Borgman offers, in contradistinction to devices, what he calls focal things, or things that sort of involve focal practices. And for Borgman, a thing is an artifact that you engage with in a physically meaningful way. And I'll get a little bit more into his definition in a moment. But for instance, against the example of a furnace, Borgman would present a wood-burning stove. Right, so a wood-burning stove probably sits, in the living area of your home. So you're interacting with it in a much more meaningful way. It takes skill, right? It's not you can't just turn it on. You have to have some skill in how you make a fire, how you build a fire, how you tend it. Focal practices can be built around it in the sense of, the family might gather around the stove. You might use the stove for cooking. It becomes much more integrated into your life. Now, Borgman would not say that a stove is necessarily better at providing the commodity of heat, and he's not saying that everybody needs to have wood-burning stoves instead of furnaces. But what he wants us to do is he wants us to think about, okay, well, what things are lost when you move from a thing to a device? Another possible example of this, if you're familiar with the book Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, in some ways is a long argument for considering a particular type of motorcycle as a thing, a Borgmannian thing, something that you're interacting with in a physically meaningful way, something that takes skill and time and care. But the sort of the issue at play when Borgman is talking about things is that he offers sort of a definition, but it's kind of vague. He doesn't give a lot of specific definitions of what a thing actually would be. And it's really easy to fall into this idea that, well, he wants us to go back, right? He wants us to go back to simpler days, simpler things, and things are simple and old-timey, and devices are new and modern. And he actually doesn't make this claim, but it's a little bit hard to sort of think about what modern technological artifacts would be ideal Borgmannian things. So here's just a quote from his '84 book. He says, look, we can say this about focal things. They're concrete, they're tangible, they're deep, and we'll talk about depth in a minute. They admit of no functional equivalence. They have a tradition, a structure, and a rhythm of their own. They engage us in the fullness of our capacities, and they thrive in a technological setting. So for Borgman, focal things are not antithetical to technology, but they can thrive in a technological environment. But again, he sort of has this problem with really manifesting some good examples of what things are, which is where I think Warhammer 40K and Warhammer 40K minis come into the equation, because I think a Warhammer 40K mini can really do some work for us as an ideal Borgmannian thing. So here page numbers refer to Borgman's text and some of the definitions rather that he gives from that quote just now. They're concrete, they're tangible. Focal things have a tradition, a structure, and a rhythm. They require a practice, right? So for instance, if you get your Warhammer 40K minis, they come in a box. They're a technological artifact, right? I don't know the industrial processes behind them. I don't know how to manufacture the plastics and the molds that are used. But when they come to me, I still have to interact with them in a physical way, right? They require a practice. These aren't action figures. And it's that practice that so many of us find so compelling, right? We're brought into a relationship with this physical object. The context becomes very important. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And what Borgman says is that they allow for a more skilled and intimate connection with the world, right? So they're an opportunity for, practicing painting skills and building skills and all these sorts of things like that. We can go on. Borgman's definition. There we go. Borgman really emphasizes this idea of engagement, right? So focal things have to be engaging. He's got all these quotes. They engage us in the fullness of our capacities. They call forth engagement and allow for a more skilled and intimate connection with the world. And he even says, this is how we should evaluate the excellence of artifacts, right? It's not about all their bells and whistles. It's about whether or not they allow for a wealth of engagement, right? Whether they bring us into a deeper connection with the physical world. And then finally, this idea of depth. Borgman says a thing is deep if all or most of its physically discernible features are finally significant, right? If you're thinking about a cell phone and the features of a cell phone, physically they don't mean much, right? All your cell phones look pretty much the same. And if you're thinking about a Warhammer minifigure, the opposite is the case, right? All of the details matter. The details on the armor, if we're talking specifically about Space Marines, the weapon in its hand, all of the things that might seem like sort of they're just there for aesthetics, actually have physical, or actually have often, and in the lore, often have significant meaning. So I think Warhammer minifigures, in a lot of ways, I think in most of the ways that Borgman is talking about, really sort of manifest this idea of a thing as opposed to a device. So, and I think when we're talking about Borgman's paradigm, we're talking about how we interact with our technologies today. We're talking about the division between devices and things. Minifigures as a technological artifact, I think you do a really good job of helping us think about, well, here's an example of a focal thing in sort of Borgman's way of thinking. Although I don't think Borgman had Warhammer 40K minifigures at all in mind as he was doing his work. But beyond that, I think that Warhammer 40K minis can actually help us sort of extend this metaphor in an interesting way. So if we're talking about focal things as things that do all these things that Borgman is talking about, that engage us physically in the depth of the physical object itself. What I think is powerful and effective about Warhammer 40K is that it sort of does this on 3 different levels. So I'm just going to briefly define these 3 different levels, and then we're going to sort of apply this to some different play technologies, and then I think we'll have plenty of time for discussion. There is, on the surface level, what we could call the artifactual depth, right? And I think this is what Borgman is initially referring to. The idea that every that as a physical object, every piece of it matters, every piece of it is significant. It has this the detail, the articulation that makes these minifigures so appealing as just physical objects. So the artifactual depth is there. But beyond that, all of that artifactual depth maps on to what we could call the arcane depth, right? And that's the lore of the Warhammer 40K world. So that I'm building this physical thing, but all of those physical details actually mean something in the lore. Again, how I paint it, besides just what faction I choose to build, all of the different details that I'm going to give it, even the weapons it's holding, all of that maps onto to the imaginary construct of the world itself and gives this an additional layer of depth. So that when I'm putting it together, I'm not just thinking about it as a physical object. I'm also thinking about how it fits in with this sort of mythical-poetic world. And then it has a third level, the applicatory depth, right? I'm building this to do something with it. The way that I build it, again, the weapons that I give it, or the armor that it's in, or how it's going to fit in with my pre-existing army of minifigures, all is going to have application on the tabletop, right? It's going to make a difference in running campaigns and how the game plays out. So there's an applicatory depth as well. I'm building this model not to simply sit on a shelf and be pretty, but to do something with it in a social engagement around the table. So I think this is sort of an interesting way to sort of extend Borgman's ideas of depth into these different levels. So if that's the case, I think this kind of gives us, and I'm doing this a little bit facetiously, but I think this gives us a sort of a fun way to evaluate, maybe philosophically, some different what we could call technologies of play, right? So I've selected a few things that I found around my house, and I'm going to try to sort of evaluate them on these levels of engagement and depth in a Borgmannian sense. So for instance, here's something that's really popular in my house right now. My sons are really into the Star Wars Unlimited playing card game. And we could say certainly there's an arcane depth there, right? There are characters that map onto to a world, an imaginary world that's out there. Certainly there's an applicatory depth. Every number and icon on this card means something and has meaning in how the game is played. But there's no artifactual depth. Right? I just take this out of the box and it's ready to play, and it's just a lovely piece of paper, basically. We could talk about something like this. We could talk about a Transformer figure, which certainly has an arcane depth, right? This is a character, and his backstory, and there's a mythos there. There's no applicatory depth. I'm not going to use this figure in any sort of gameplay. And we could debate whether it has artifactual depth, right? It is an artifact. You can transform it and pose it, but I'm not going to interact with it on the depth. I'm not going to build it right from the ground up in the way that I construct a Warhammer 40K mini. Or we could talk about a Gundam model, right? Certainly there's an artifactual depth there, right? It does have all of that intricacy of detail, putting it together, building it, painting it. You could talk about the arcane depth if you want to talk about what Gundam model this is, what series it represents, who the pilot was. There is a mythos behind this. But again, there's no applicatory depth. I'm not going to use this in a specific gameplay format. Which then, of course, brings us to something like my Primaris Aggressor, which has, as I've argued, has a deep artifactual depth. It has an arcane depth. It has applicatory depth. So it checks all the boxes. And in a philosophical way, makes Warhammer 40K miniatures the superior play technology. Now, if you're interested in this, like this idea of Borgman's paradigm, devices, things, how this sort of plays out today, I was thinking a lot about this in terms of wind technologies. And so I published an essay this past summer in Aeon magazine that looks at the sort of in the sort of how wind technology has played out in history, and sort of what that can do for us, and how we think and talk about modern wind technology. So I wanted to throw this out there as well, but I'm going to park it here, and I'm very happy to open it up for discussion.